Fire was never supposed to exist inside a classroom, not this kind of fire. It started with a flick, a tiny spark from a human's thumb, and ended with every alien in the room diving for cover as a wave of flame roared across the lab. By the time the smoke cleared, the sprinklers hissed like rain over melted instruments, and the only one still standing was the human calm, expressionless, holding a metal box and a can. Hours earlier, it was just another day at the Galactic Anthropology Academy. Students had filled their tables with relics of the past, stone axes, bone spears, ceremonial blades, each a tribute to how far their species had evolved. One table displayed a spiral-toothed fossil weapon from the brine world of Alosia. Another showcased a vine-bound hammer carved from the bone of a megafauna long extinct on Thule. No one sharpened their blades. No one expected danger. The assignment was academic, historical, harmless. Professor Velan, tall, soft-hued, and meticulous in both speech and manner, floated slightly above the platform in the center of the auditorium. Her species never touched the ground unnecessarily. 100 students from 50 different planets leaned in with the excitement of amateur archaeologists. "This exercise," she announced, her antennae twitching gently, "will explore the origins of conflict and culture. Demonstrate a primitive weapon from your homeworld. Something simple, something safe." The last word hung in the air like a contract. Tables began to buzz with movement. Students unpacked items with reverence, placing them beneath low-gravity clamps and protective domes. The Corthan twins had brought a holographic simulation of their ancestral plasma slings, too unstable to build with actual matter. The Drell student had an entire altar laid out, with ceremonial tongs used by her ancestors to cauterize invading organisms. Each student explained their item's historical context, evolution, and ethical abandonment. Professor Velan nodded with approval at each presentation. Then the door hissed open. Rian walked in, late again, wearing his academy-issued boots like they'd betrayed him at breakfast. His brown hair was slightly damp either from a recent shower or a complete disregard for punctuality, and he held nothing that even resembled a weapon. Just a silver lighter. And a can. Velan's expression shifted. "Cadet Rian, we were beginning without you." He stepped forward with a faint nod. "Apologies, Professor. Compressed tram schedules. That doesn't explain the absence of your assigned material." Rian lifted both objects for everyone to see. "It's right here." A few students laughed. One snorted. A Thralin near the back muttered, "Is that grooming spray?" "Maybe it's for cleaning his relic," another added, chuckling. Ryan gave no response. He stepped calmly up to the table left for him and set the items down with the care of someone placing sacred artifacts. The can read, "Power Spray Ultra Fresh Pine." The lighter had a faded brass shell, pockmarked with age, and a faint inscription worn by time. He opened it with a metallic snap and spun the wheel with his thumb. A small, soft flame emerged. Professor Velan, trying not to betray impatience, arched her neck slightly. "You intend to demonstrate fire?" "No," Rian replied, tilting the aerosol can toward the flame. "I intend to demonstrate pressure and ignition." Then he pressed the nozzle. The room exploded with light. A jet of fire burst from the can, with a ferocity that no one had prepared for. The flame, long and angry, roared over the table and streaked a bright orange trail across the air, forcing several students to dive for cover. Heat sensors wailed. The shielding around the front row shimmered violently, struggling to absorb the sudden spike in temperature. One alien fell backward from its station, pulling its tentacle limbs into a fetal coil. Professor Velan had frozen mid-gesture. Even her species' typically detached demeanor cracked as she ducked instinctively. Fire in a closed environment, in a space-rated, oxygen-stabilized environment, was no minor threat. Ryan released the nozzle after a single, searing arc. The flame sputtered out. He snapped the lighter shut and stepped back. Silence fell. The only sound was the soft hiss of the emergency mist, already descending from the ceiling like synthetic fog. A red alert began to pulse near the back wall. "Explain," Professor Velan demanded, recovering her posture slowly. Ryan glanced at the table, now partially scorched, and shrugged not dismissively but as someone gently stating a fact. "We call it a flamethrower. Early humans used it for close-range combat. No circuitry, no reactor, just combustion. You brought an active incendiary device into a sealed classroom? He nodded. Technically, it's just deodorant. Another silence. It's a type of grooming agent, he clarified, catching the baffled expressions. The professor floated downward, touching the floor for the first time that day, and approached the table with measured steps. Her hand hovered over the can without touching it. She read the label aloud slowly, like it might detonate. A pressurized container, hydrocarbon propellant, ethanol base. Standard contents, Ryan added. In an oxygen-rich atmosphere, it becomes flammable. Add a spark. And you create a weapon capable of breaching low-tier plasma shielding, she said, eyes scanning the thermal readout. From behind the observation barrier, a Vren student whimpered. You carried that inside the academy? Ryan didn't flinch. It's not dangerous unless you light it. Another voice, trembling and shrill, protested from the back. That's not primitive. That's chemical warfare. No, Ryan said calmly. This is chemistry. Simple combustion. Even schoolchildren on Earth used to know how to do this. Professor Wieland backed away from the display, her usually serene face taut with something close to unease. You built this before quantum flight? Long before, Ryan said. How long? He considered it. We were manufacturing aerosols by the 1940 seconds. Lighters go back even earlier. The concept of flame projection using chemical ignition was battlefield standard before we ever launched a satellite. Why? She whispered. To clear bunkers, to make people afraid to move. The room went very still. Ryan didn't smile. There was no pride in his voice, no triumph in his posture. He stood like someone explaining gravity factual, inevitable. Professor Wieland dismissed the class early, citing environmental recalibration protocols. Most students exited quickly, casting wary glances over their shoulders. Ryan stayed behind to help clean up the water left by the fire suppression system. He worked without complaint, his boots squelching slightly in the puddles. The professor remained near the table, eyes on the lighter. It was old, scratched. Someone's initials were barely visible beneath the burn marks. You carry this everywhere? She asked finally. Ryan nodded once. It's not a weapon anymore, just a reminder. Of what? He looked down at the lighter, then back at her. That everything powerful starts as something small, and that humans never forgot how to make fire. She said nothing. Outside the lab, a fresh sign was already being mounted to the wall. New policy. No human students may bring flammable materials into anthropology labs. They didn't call it a disciplinary hearing. Technically, it was a cultural compliance debrief. But Ryan had already been in the academy long enough to know when he was about to get chewed out. The room was circular, with walls that shifted in color based on emotional tension, currently a nervous shade of amber. A semi-transparent desk pulsed lightly in front of the assembled panel, which included a rotation of senior instructors, ethics observers, and 2 security officers who hovered behind the panel with unsettling stillness. Professor Wieland stood off to the side, not seated with the others, but clearly present by invitation. Her eyes didn't meet Ryan's. Ryan, seated alone in the center, kept his hands on the table, and his lighter in a sealed containment pouch strapped to his thigh. The aerosol had already been confiscated. He hadn't asked for it back. In your own words, said the lead panelist, a bulbous species whose speech smelled faintly of burnt almonds, describe the purpose of your demonstration. It was a practical representation, Ryan said, keeping his voice level, of how early humans weaponized pressurized chemistry. Why not submit a less volatile display? Because that's what we used, Ryan said. It wasn't theoretical. We didn't simulate these things. We built them. The panel buzzed for a moment, translating murmurs into shared thought channels. A screen behind them flickered on, replaying the slow-motion footage captured by the lab's security system. The flame was longer than anyone had realized. It had arced dangerously close to the observation barrier, which, under stress from the heat, had temporarily lost 5% of its energy cohesion. The screen flickered off. You could have injured someone, said the panelist. I didn't, Ryan replied. That's not the point. Ryan leaned back slightly. The point was to show the truth. We've always been able to turn the mundane into the dangerous. That's who we were sometimes, who we still are. A second panelist, long-limbed and draped in ceremonial synthcloth, interjected. There is a protocol for demonstrations involving live reactions. You bypassed it. Because no one saw it as a real weapon, Rian said, not until it was already burning. That earned him a pointed look from Professor Violan, but she said nothing. The first panelist shifted, the coloration of his skin moving from almond to olive gray. Your academy record shows multiple minor infractions related to lateness, unfiled waivers, and non-standard conduct in cultural coursework. Rian didn't argue, he just nodded. So, let us ask the broader question. Do you believe humans are capable of fully integrating with our interspecies educational model? Or do you consider your methods fundamentally incompatible? It was a trap, a cultural compliance test disguised as an academic question. If he said yes, they'd demand proof of his future restraint. If he said no, they could cite philosophical divergence and boot him off-world. Rian took a long breath. Humans don't adapt by mimicking, we adapt by absorbing and reshaping. Sometimes that looks like rebellion, sometimes that looks like creativity, but it's not incompatibility. It's a different route to the same goal. Silence. Then Professor Velen finally spoke. May I address the cadet directly? The panel gave a silent nod. She stepped forward, slow and deliberate. When she reached his table, she rested one hand on the edge, not confrontational, but grounding. I studied human conflict theory for 30 years before I ever met one of you. Your histories are thick with contradiction, enlightenment, and brutality side by side. Rian listened, unsure where she was going. When I assigned this demonstration, she continued, I expected something like a bow or a sling, something archaic, inert, not fire, not pressure and heat and ethanol, and certainly not something you could carry in your pocket. ISS. He didn't answer. You showed us something honest, she said, her voice softer now. Too honest. Then, turning to the panel, I recommend a temporary suspension from all lab access coursework, not expulsion, just caution. The panel deliberated for less than 30 seconds. Approved. Rian stood slowly as the decision was finalized. He didn't flinch or protest. He simply nodded, collected the sealed pouch, and exited the hearing room without another word. Outside, the hallway stretched into sterile blue light. He walked alone for a while, hearing nothing but the echo of his boots. Then, someone fell in beside him. It was Mazik, a Drell student who sat 3 tables over during the lab. She looked at him without her usual grin. They thought you were going to kill someone. I didn't. Doesn't mean they weren't scared, she said. I was scared. Rian nodded, his shoulders tense. I didn't light it to show off. I lit it because it mattered. Mazik studied him for a second, then asked, Do all humans learn how to do that? Make fire like that? Not officially. Some kids figure it out on their own. It's stupid, reckless. But it sticks with you. Not officially. Because once you've seen fire come out of something that's supposed to smell like pine and armpits, you realize what kind of world you live in. She blinked slowly. That's the most human sentence I've ever heard. They kept walking. By the end of the corridor, they reached a clear partition overlooking the atmospheric garden dome. A few students were gathered on the benches below. Rian paused, watching them. Mazik watched him. What's next? I get reassigned to archives for 2 weeks. No labs, no tech modules. Will you bring the lighter? He shook his head. Not this time. As he turned to leave, Mazik called out, You scared the hell out of us. But it's the first time I understood what it means when humans say they earn peace. Rian didn't turn around. He just raised his hand slightly in acknowledgement and walked away, the lighter still warm in its case, tucked against his leg like a memory he wasn't finished with. The archive annex smelled like static and silence. Deep in the lower decks of the academy, far from the lecture halls and communal atriums, the place was built for data, not people. Its halls were lined with cylindrical stacks, each holding thousands of etched memory strands, analog storage from pre-digital eras, preserved for comparative anthropology. No one came here unless they had to. Rian had been there for 6 days. The punishment wasn't cruel, just dull. He was tasked with cataloging ancient cultural artifacts submitted from outer sectors, identifying which were ceremonial, which were utilitarian, and which, inevitably, were weapons. He was halfway through a classification cluster on early Koreshi bonecraft when Professor Vielan walked in. He looked up but didn't stand. The last time they spoke, she'd indirectly helped reduce what could have been a tribunal to a lab suspension. He figured he owed her equal measures of respect and wariness. She didn't speak right away, just looked around the vault. It was a far cry from her usual academic stage. Then, as if casually, she set a data slate on the table in front of him. He frowned. The screen was blank, save for the Academy seal and a cryptic code tag. Reacquisition order. Incident 7BX. Field Demonstration Authorization Review. What is this? You're being reassigned, she said, temporarily. To what? To the Security Science Exchange, she replied. Not permanently. Just long enough to satisfy a few diplomatic anxieties. Because I waved a can of deodorant at your sensor grid? Because you demonstrated a working weapon without a circuit, without targeting software, without needing anything but your own body to operate it. You frighten people, Rian. Important people. He leaned back. This is still punishment. No, this is curiosity. Dressed in fear? Maybe, but curiosity all the same. The exchange was a modular station docked near the Dalkan border. It hosted cross-cultural drills for cadets selected from multiple academies across the coalition. The invitation list included tactical theorists, emergency responders, and a handful of specialists in legacy armament systems weapons from before standardization. Rian's name was now one of them. He sighed and rubbed a hand across his jaw. When do I leave? Vielan gave him a rare smile. Now. The Dalkan Security Exchange was sterile in its precision. Everything buzzed, clicked, or pulsed in symmetrical order. The only things out of place were the students. They wandered the polished halls in confused clumps, each wearing the same slightly overwhelmed expression. Rian found his assigned berth easily. It was compact, but comfortable enough until he noticed the intake restrictions pinned to the door. Every item he'd brought had to be scanned twice, including his boots. The lighter, of course, didn't make it. He was summoned the next day to Subdeck 12, where 2 instructors and a hazard compliance officer stood next to what looked like a burn-scarred testing chamber. The hazard officer, a small insectoid who wore his exosuit like ceremonial armor, gestured Rian inside. We've prepared a simulation room. The objective is simple. Demonstrate an example of primitive human conflict techniques. No flames this time. Rian raised an eyebrow. You're setting limits before I've even started? No, the officer said flatly. We're setting boundaries because our insurance clause now includes human improvisation. Rian stepped into the simulation zone, the door sealed behind him with a hiss. The room looked like a stylized recreation of a mid-20th century Earth alleyway. Concrete walls, scattered metal debris, a few wooden crates. High above, observation drones hovered in silent clusters. A panel on the far wall blinked green. Scenario start. Simulate improvised melee defense. No electronic assistance. Begin. Rian moved cautiously. Nothing happened for 5 seconds. Then a drone dropped a training drone the size of a trash can from the ceiling. It zipped toward him, with non-lethal velocity, but enough force to leave a bruise or break a nose if he wasn't careful. He ducked and scanned the area. The crates, a length of pipe, a rusted trash lid, nothing designed as a weapon, but everything potentially useful. He grabbed the lid. When the drone swung back around, he caught its arc with the lid and slammed it against the wall with a metallic crunch. The impact bent the drone's stabilizer. It buzzed erratically, then shut down. The lights dimmed. Scenario end. Analysis in progress. He dropped the lid. The door unsealed. The instructors didn't clap, but they looked intrigued. The insectoid hazard officer stepped forward, antennae twitching. You saw the material options? I saw possibilities. You neutralized a Class A drone using unreinforced waist shielding. Worked fine. The hazard officer turned to the instructors and muttered, They make these things by instinct, like breathing. Later that night, Rian was summoned again not to the testing room, but but to the open forum hall. There was a panel of visiting diplomats seated in elevated viewports, and a small crowd of students and observers. Mazik was among them. Apparently, word of Rian's reassignment had gotten around. A screen played clips of Earth history. Grainy black and white footage. Soldiers in trenches, Molotov cocktails, teenagers with slingshots, early city riots with makeshift barricades and burning tires. Then, abruptly, a segment of someone flicking a Zippo lighter and igniting a canister. The flame burst out across an open field, caught by infrared sensors. Rian stood at the podium in front of them all. The moderator, a pale, wide-eyed humanoid named Solon, adjusted his audio gear and asked the question everyone else had come for. How did your species survive this stage? Rian didn't blink. We didn't. Not all of us. A ripple moved through the audience. But you made it to space. Because we kept records, because we remembered the things that burned. Solon hesitated. Would you demonstrate something else for us? Rian raised an eyebrow. Like what? Something non-lethal, still primitive, still human. He considered it. Then he pulled out a shoelace, a simple earth-made lace, and a small ball bearing from his uniform toolkit. He tied a knot, spun it twice, and let it fly. The bearing struck the practice dummy at the far end of the room, dead center between the eyes. Silence. Then a single diplomat leaned forward and whispered, awestruck, "You turned a string into a weapon." Rian turned toward him calmly. "No, I turned desperation into a solution. The string just happened to be there." The hall was still for a long time. Outside, beyond the transparent dome, the stars blinked silently. Somewhere among them were thousands of species, most of whom had never known what it meant to fear what you could do with nothing but your hands. The next morning, Rian found himself escorted, not summoned, to the exchange's central operations room. 2 officers flanked him, neither speaking, though their posture made it clear this was no casual meeting. Inside, the room was dark, except for a ring of soft violet lights along the floor. A holographic display hovered above a wide conference table, shifting slowly between planetary maps, security protocols, and archived footage. Professor Violan stood to the side, arms crossed, looking like she hadn't slept. She nodded toward the table. "Sit." Rian complied. A large alien presence loomed opposite him. General Erkson of the Dalkan Defense Network, a creature whose upper body resembled twisted cables and mineral plating, leaned in, his crystalline gaze unblinking. "You are the human who built fire with deodorant." Rian blinked once. That's one way to put it. Erksan's heavy jaw creaked open slightly. "I find your skills vexing, dangerous, but applicable." Professor Violan interjected. "The general has requested a live tutorial." Rian frowned. "Tutorial?" "A demonstration of human improvisation under restraint," Erksan clarified. "Your species' methods are unpredictable. Our simulations fail to account for spontaneous application of non-weapons as weapons. We wish to study this behavior directly." He raised a massive hand and gestured. A steel-walled chamber adjacent to the operations room hissed open. Inside stood 5 volunteers, interspecies cadets, fitted with monitoring suits. The space was cluttered with benign objects: crates, food containers, cords, textiles, adhesives, kitchenware. "You will enter that room," Erksan said. "You will not harm them, but you will show us how you would prepare to win if you had to. Time limit, 10 minutes. And if I refuse?" Violan gave him a sharp look. "Then you confirm the coalition's suspicion that humans pose a liability to shared advancement." Rian rubbed his temple, exhaled slowly, and rose. "Fine. Just don't breathe too hard when I start moving things around." Inside the chamber, he kept his hands behind his back for a full minute, just studying. The crates were lightweight polymer. The food containers were resealable, with rigid lids brittle under pressure. The cords were long enough to trip someone but not bind them. There was a full tin of powdered grain substitute on the table, right next to a portable induction stove. First move. He dumped the powder into the air, near the stove. Then he yanked one of the heating coils loose and let it dangle near the fine dust. Gasps from the viewing deck. Violan leaned toward Erksan. Combustible flour. Suspended in air, it behaves like an explosive. We had a whole decade of industrial accidents from that alone. Next, Rian took the cords, knotted them into low-level trip lines, and strung them across a choke point between two crates. Not tall enough to be noticed from afar, but guaranteed to disrupt any rush. He pulled fabric from the cushions and twisted them into improvised friction gloves. Then he stripped the foil insulation from a food pack and folded it into a narrow, jagged-edge strip, a cutting tool, crude but functional. He paused. Then, slowly, he picked up the resealable containers and filled them with water from the hydration station, lined them along the back wall. When the cadets were finally signaled to enter, he stood still, hands empty. They moved cautiously, analyzing the dust cloud, the tripwires, the stove coil still dangling near open powder. None crossed the threshold. He didn't move. He didn't need to. The demonstration ended without a single confrontation. Back in the viewing deck, Erksan watched the playback. He built deterrence. Violan nodded. That's often how it starts. Rian was called in again. Erksan stared at him for a long time before speaking. We trained for centuries to design tools for war. Your species seems to discover them by accident. Rian's voice was quiet, even. Not accident. Circumstance. I see now, Erksan said. You're not improvisers, you're survivors, and there's a difference. That night, Rian sat alone in the observation garden. Mazik joined him again, handing him a bland nutrient bar without ceremony. You could have lit up the whole room, she said. Could have. But you didn't. He looked at her. I wasn't asked to attack, just to show how we prepare. That's the difference. Mazik unwrapped her own bar and took a bite. You know what everyone's talking about now? What? They're saying humans carry war in their pockets, that you weaponize trash, that you turn kitchens into traps. Sounds about right. But they're also saying you never start fights, you just make damn sure you don't lose them. He nodded slowly. She bumped his shoulder. Don't get smug about it. I won't. When we need Chaptate. A soft chime echoed from his wrist terminal. A message from the academy. Reinstatement approved. Lab access restored. He closed the alert without reacting. Mazik glanced at him. Back to school? Looks like it. She smirked, but her tone was serious. Don't set anything on fire this time. Ryan stretched his legs out on the bench. Only if they ask nicely. The return to the Galactic Anthropology Academy was quiet, no crowd waiting at the dock, no curious cadets trailing behind. Just Ryan, one bag slung over his shoulder, and the same long walk from the tramport to the central campus under the low artificial sky. Nothing had visibly changed. The trees still glowed faintly violet at night. The dorm spires still shimmered with the pulse of internal air systems. The walls still bore the soft geometric sheen that made everything feel mildly antiseptic. But something had shifted. No one looked at him quite the same way. The instructors acknowledged him now with a fraction more calculation. The students, especially the non-human ones, watched him with a mix of wariness and curiosity. They spoke to him with respect, yes, but also like someone carrying something they couldn't see. It wasn't fear exactly. It was awareness. His first class back was environmental adaptation theory, held in one of the newer lecture spheres with fully holographic terrain projection. It wasn't until halfway through the discussion on volcanic survival shelters that Professor Violan paused mid-sentence. I want to address something unrelated to our scheduled topic, she said, her tone neutral. Cadet Rian, are you carrying any objects that may constitute improvised fire starters? There was a small ripple of laughter across the room. Ryan shook his head. Not today. She nodded once, then resumed. But the tension had cracked into something else. Not trust, not yet, but a kind of acceptance. The human wasn't a wild variable anymore. He was part of the equation. After class, she caught up with him in the corridor. Come with me, she said, and led him without explanation to Lab Wing Delta, one of the oldest parts of the academy, unused, half-renovated, with relic storage and defunct calibration chambers. At the far end was a heavy sealed room, one he'd never entered before. She scanned her credentials. The door opened with a slow mechanical sigh. Inside, dust, old data cores, test modules, and a single central table holding a thick, transparent case. Inside the case was his lighter. She stepped aside. We had it sealed, logged, and analyzed by 3 departments. Did they learn anything? They learned your species doesn't need energy cells to be dangerous. He studied the lighter a long moment. It looked small under the spotlight, unthreatening, harmless, just metal and memory. Why bring me here? To return it. He looked at her, surprised. It's not a weapon unless you make it one, she said. And besides, we've now amended our database. Flamethrowers, common primitive weapon. Species origin, human. Status, field capable. He snorted softly. You're joking. Her expression didn't shift. I never joke in lab registries. She handed him the lighter. He turned it over in his palm, the weight familiar, grounding. He didn't flick it open. I still don't think they understand, he said quietly. Who? Any of them. Most of the species here came from structured evolution conflict shaped by order, war shaped by rules. But humans. He paused. We burned before we built, we killed before we cooperated, fire came before tools, and fear came before peace. She tilted her head. You're saying humanity started from a darker place. I'm saying we climbed out of it, and we left signs behind, scorch marks, charred ruins, mottos engraved in rusted helmets. She studied him carefully. You don't speak like most cadets. He offered a faint grin. You've seen my grades. I barely am most cadets. There was a long silence. Then she walked to the terminal, tapped in a command, and activated the room's central holodisplay. A projection formed not of war footage or historical stats, but a quiet field. Grassy, Earth normal gravity, trees waving in the wind. And in the middle, a small campfire, the flame contained in a ring of stones. She gestured. Your species did this too. He watched the flame flicker. Yeah, he said. We didn't just make weapons. We made warmth, stories, light. Another pause. He didn't break it. Then she spoke again, almost reluctant. I reviewed the footage of the exchange sessions. Let me guess, overkill? No, strategy. He glanced at her. You taught them something we couldn't. That power isn't always in the weapon. Sometimes it's in the choice not to use it. He looked back at the flame. The room was silent, save for the ambient hum of the holo projector. I wasn't trying to scare anyone, he said eventually. I know. They stood there for another minute, just watching. When he left the lab, lighter back in his pocket, he didn't head straight to his dorm. Instead, he stopped at the campus garden, pulled up a bench, and sat under the unfamiliar stars. He stared upward until the light began to change color for artificial dusk. Mazik found him there again. You lit any new fires? She asked, flopping onto the bench beside him. Not yet. She nodded at his pocket. You get it back? He tapped it through the fabric. Yeah. She was quiet a moment. They said you scared a Dalkan general into rewriting 5 training protocols. He asked for a demo. Mazik laughed once, sharp and short. Only a human could turn grooming spray into a security risk. He turned to her. You want to know what the worst part is? Always. We didn't do that because we were clever or violent. We did it because we didn't have anything else. She tilted her head. Meaning? Rian pulled out the lighter, finally flicking it open. The flame was small, gentle, almost elegant. Humans didn't start wars because we wanted to. We started them because we were cold, hungry, cornered, and when the tools weren't enough, we made new ones, even if they were awful, even if they burned. Mazik stared at the flame. And now? He shut it again. Now, we carry reminders. Not because we're proud, but because we're still learning how not to be that version of ourselves. Mazik leaned back, thoughtful. Maybe the rest of us needed to see that. That history isn't just something you bury under peace. Sometimes you carry it. You wrestle with it. And you keep it in your pocket. Rian didn't reply. The two sat in the fading light. At the academy's entrance, A new policy screen cycled through regulations. Right after the advisory about interspecies dietary restrictions, a new line glowed faintly. Item #47. Do not assign humans primitive weapon demonstrations. The fire, after all, had been real. But so was the choice not to use it again.